He was 18 and homeless. No house, no truck, no money in the bank. Just a faded olive military duffel, a forest green Mackinaw wool coat, and his late mother's brass harmonica wrapped in a cotton handkerchief in the inside left pocket of his coat, against his heart. And with $1, he bought an abandoned lighthouse keeper's cottage on a wind-stripped basalt headland called Cape Halgren on the central Oregon coast, 8 miles south of Yachtschatz. The county clerk told him the place hadn't been kept since 1962. The Coast Guard veteran who walked him through the inspection told him the basalt foundation had been losing mortar for 60 years and would not survive another decade of Pacific storms. The old lighthouse keeper who ran the small hardware store in the village 2 miles inland, who knew the cottage because he had been the last man stationed there before the Coast Guard had automated the light in 1981, told him plainly that nobody had wanted that cottage for 42 years, and nobody would want it now. But what nobody knew was that behind a hinged false back panel inside the old wooden writing desk in the cottage parlor, in a small leather-wrapped bundle that had not been touched since the year the second principal keeper of Cape Halgren Light had laid down his lamp for the last time, was something that would change his life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this bring you comfort, you might want to know that we have a small community here on the channel. It's called a membership, and it's a simple way to support the stories we tell. It's never required, but if you've been watching for a while and these stories mean something to you, it means the world to us. There's a join button right below this video. His name was Mateo Reyes, and he had grown up in a small 2-bedroom apartment in northwest Portland, on a quiet residential street 4 blocks from the hospital, where his mother had worked as a cleaner for 16 years. His mother's name had been Linda Reyes. She had been 36 years old when she had died. Linda had raised Mateo alone. His father, a man Linda had met at 23 and parted from at 25, had not stayed long enough to see Mateo's first birthday. Linda had not spoken of him often, and when she had, it had always been kindly, in the way of a woman who had decided long ago that bitterness was a poor companion to raise a child beside. Mateo had a single photograph of his father, taken on a beach in Astoria in the autumn of 2005. A thin, tall young man squinting at the camera with a hand shading his eyes, and he had no memory of him at all. Linda's people had come over from the Philippines 4 generations earlier. Her great-grandfather, a man named Mateo Reyes from the small town of Vigan in northern Luzon, had come to America in 1924, when he had been 21, and had worked the Alaska salmon canneries each summer and the asparagus fields of Central California each winter for the better part of 2 decades. He had married a Filipina-American girl in Stockton in 1942 and had moved his family north to Portland in 1951 to work for a small Filipino-owned grocery on Mississippi Avenue. The family had been in Oregon ever since. Linda had been the third of Doroteo's grandchildren and the only one who had stayed in Portland. The others had all moved south or east, California, Las Vegas, Texas, for warmer weather and better jobs. Linda had not minded the rain. She had not minded the work. She had minded sometimes on the nights when Mateo had been small and asleep in the next room, the loneliness of raising a son alone in a city where the rest of her family had already gone. She had played the harmonica on the small front porch of the apartment on summer evenings, after she had washed the dishes and put Mateo to bed. The harmonica had belonged to her own mother, who had died when Linda had been 28. Linda had played quietly, slow blues, and old Filipino kundiman melodies her grandmother had hummed when Linda had been a girl. And Mateo had grown up listening to her play through the wall of his bedroom. falling asleep to the soft amber sound of her breath through the brass. Linda had caught the flu in early February of Mateo's junior year of high school. She had been 36. The flu had progressed in 3 days into pneumonia, and the pneumonia had progressed in 2 more days into an aggressive secondary infection, and the secondary infection had killed her on a Sunday morning in a hospital bed 3 floors above the cleaning supply closet where she had spent half her working life. Mateo had been 16. There had been no family to take him. The aunts in California had been kind on the phone, and the great-uncles in Las Vegas had wired money for the funeral, but no one had offered to bring a 16-year-old boy into a household 2,000 miles from his school and his neighborhood. The state of Oregon had assigned him an emergency foster family in southwest Portland. A kind, older couple named the Petersons, who had 3 other foster children already, and who had done their best. And Mateo had finished his junior year of high school sleeping on a fold-out sofa in their basement, with the brass harmonica in a sock at the bottom of his school backpack. The Petersons could not keep him after his 18th birthday in November of his senior year, because the state stopped paying for non-relative foster placement at majority, and they could not afford to keep him without it. Mateo had spent the spring of his senior year couch surfing among 3 different classmates' families, 2 weeks at a time, finishing his schoolwork at kitchen tables and showering quickly so as not to use too much hot water. He had graduated in June with a small handful of unopened cards and a community college acceptance letter he had not been able to afford to act on. For the 2 months after graduation, he had slept on a park bench in a quiet corner of Mount Tabor Park, Portland. He had washed dishes at a Vietnamese restaurant on Hawthorne for cash, 6 nights a week. He had kept his clothes in a locker at the YMCA. He had read library books in the afternoons. He had played his mother's harmonica on the bench at night, very softly when there was no one near enough to hear. In early August, an old man who lived on the edge of the park, a Korean War veteran named Mr. Kowalski, who walked his dog past Mateo's bench every morning, had stopped one Tuesday and had handed Mateo a folded slip of paper. "My cousin," Mr. Kowalski had said, "lives in a town on the Oregon coast called Yachts, south of Newport. There's a man there named Owen Halvorsen, Norwegian, runs a hardware store. He used to be a Coast Guard lighthouse keeper. He's a good man. I called him last night. He's expecting you." Mateo had not known what to say. He had taken the paper. He had thanked Mr. Kowalski twice. Mr. Kowalski had only nodded and walked his dog on. 2 days later, with $63 in his pocket and the harmonica in the inside left chest pocket of the Mackinaw coat his mother had bought him from a thrift shop the winter she died, Mateo had ridden a Greyhound bus 4 hours west and south across the Coast Range, getting off in the small village of Yachts at 3 in the afternoon, with the smell of the Pacific salt wind in his face for the first time in his life. The hardware store was called Halvorsen's. The sign above the door was hand-painted, faded white on weathered cedar, the lettering slightly uneven. Mateo had stood on the sidewalk for some time before he had pushed open the door. Owen Halvorsen was 71 years old, a retired Norwegian-American Coast Guard lighthouse keeper who had tended the Cape Halgren light from 1972 until its automation in 1981, and who had run the hardware store alone since 1989. He was tall and stooped, with a heavy white beard, pale blue eyes set deep in a wind-cured face, and the broad, calloused hands of a man who had spent 53 years reading the Pacific weather. He had taken one look at Mateo standing in the doorway in a Mackinaw coat, a size too big and a duffel he had carried alone from a park bench, and he had not asked any questions. "You eat yet, son?" "Yes, sir." "You sure?" Mateo had been quiet a moment. "No, sir." "Come on back." There had been a small wood stove and a battered enamel coffee pot in the back of the store, and a small fridge where Owen kept his lunch. Owen had heated up a cast-iron pan of leftover venison stew on the stove, and had cut him 2 thick slices of dark rye bread from a loaf wrapped in paper. Mateo had eaten while Owen had wiped his hands on a shop rag and had watched him eat. After a long time, Owen had said, "Kowalski tell you anything about me?" "He said you used to be a lighthouse keeper." "2 of them. Cape Halgren first. Then Heseta Head for a year before they automated her too." Mateo had nodded. Owen had been quiet a long moment. Then he had said, "You play that harmonica?" Mateo had looked up. "In your coat. I can see the outline. Don't be embarrassed. I had a brother who carried his." "It was my mother's." Owen had nodded slowly. He had not asked about the mother. He had only said, "You're a long way from home, son. Sit a while." Owen had let him sleep in the back room of the hardware store that night, on a folding cot near the wood stove. He had let him stay 5 weeks. Mateo worked off the rent, sweeping, sorting bins of brass screws and washers, fetching coffee from the diner down the block, stocking shelves with the slow, careful attention of a young man who had grown up in his mother's small, clean apartment, and who knew the value of putting a thing back where it belonged. Owen paid him $100 a week in cash, and never once asked about the months between his mother's funeral and the bus from Portland. It was Owen who told him about the cottage. It was the 4th week. They had been sitting on stools at the counter, drinking coffee at 3 in the afternoon, while a slow August fog came in off the Pacific. Owen had been reading the legal notices in the back of the Yacht Snooze Times, the way old men do. Owen had said. "What?" "Counties selling the old keeper's cottage at Cape Halgren. $1 plus $418 in back taxes and an inspection fee. Nobody's bid on it in 17 years. Mateo had set his coffee down. "It's still standing?" "Standing. Not well. The Coast Guard kept it on the books till 1998 in case they needed a relief station. They sold it to the county the year my back gave out. The county tried to sell it for 10 years, gave up, condemned it in 2008, and tried again last spring." "Where is it?" 2 miles south of here, off the highway. Half a mile down a private gravel track that the county hasn't maintained since 2008. Owen had folded the paper and looked at Mateo over the top of his reading glasses. "I haven't been inside that cottage in 43 years. Take me there." The county clerk's office in Waldport, 15 miles north, was a small wooden building behind the courthouse. The clerk was a woman in her late 60s named Margaret Coombs, with bifocals and a careful, measured way of speaking that softened slightly when Owen vouched for Mateo standing beside her counter. "You sure about this, son?" "Yes, ma'am." "It's been condemned for 17 years. "Yes, ma'am." "There's no power. The well caved in. The road is not maintained. The light tower is sealed by the Coast Guard and is not part of the deed. Only the keeper's cottage and the half-acre of headland it sits on." "Yes, ma'am." She had looked at him a long moment. Then she had picked up the rubber stamp. $419. He had set $1 in folded bills, the 63 he had carried from Portland, and the rest in cash he had earned at Owen's hardware store on the counter. Margaret had counted it, stamped the deed, signed it in 2 places, and slid him a brass key on a faded green ribbon. "Welcome to the coast," she had said. Owen drove him out to the cottage that afternoon in his old white Ford pickup. They turned off Highway 101 onto an unmarked gravel track that ran west between 2 stands of wind-swept Sitka spruce, and they bumped slowly down the track for half a mile until the spruce ended and the headland opened in front of them. A long, bare, grassy point sloping to the cliffs and the Pacific beyond. The cottage sat on a small natural shelf on the leeward side of the point, sheltered from the worst of the southwest gales by a low rib of basalt that ran up from the cliff edge. From the gravel track it looked like a small 1.5-story granite block and cedar shingle house that someone had set down on the cliff 100 years ago and walked away from. The cedar shingles were silvered to driftwood gray. The cedar shake roof was patched with green moss and rust-streaked tin. The single brick chimney leaned slightly toward the sea. 2 tall, front-facing 6-pane windows had most of the glass broken or boarded over. The heavy, weathered Dutch door, painted white once, had peeled to the bare wood and stood slightly ajar. 50 feet beyond the cottage, on a narrow rib of basalt at the cliff edge, the small, white-painted lighthouse tower itself rose 2 stories tall, its black iron lantern room sealed behind aluminum panels by the Coast Guard. Mateo stood on the grassy shelf for a long time before he walked the stone path to the door. The first thing he noticed inside was the smell. 63 years of cedar and salt and faint kerosene, and the deeper, older smell of wool and lamp oil, and the thin, sweet scent of beeswax that someone had once used to polish the floors. The second thing he noticed was how much was still inside. The cottage was 24 feet by 18, 2 rooms downstairs and a small loft above. The downstairs front room was the parlor. A small cast-iron stove in one corner, a low wooden bench under one window, a long built-in bookshelf along the inner wall still holding a row of dust-grayed books, and against the back wall a large wooden writing desk with a hinged top and 4 drawers along its right side. The desk was made of straight-grained Douglas fir, finished dark with 60 years of lamp oil, with brass drawer pulls and iron strap hinges at the back of the hinged top. Mateo set his duffel on the bench. He turned in a slow circle. He pressed his palm against the desk. The wood was sound. The roof had a few small leaks that had stained the floor below them, but the floor joists were still solid. He took the harmonica out of his inside left pocket. He turned it over in his hand. He set it on the desk beside him. He went to look at the writing desk's drawers. He had not been looking for a hidden compartment. He had only been opening the drawers in the way of a young man taking inventory of a place he had just bought. The top drawer held a row of brass keeper's tools, a small brass flame trimmer, a whale oil dropper, a wick gauge, that had not been touched in more than 60 years. The second drawer held a careful row of leather-bound logbooks by year in a neat row. The third drawer was different. The drawer face was Douglas fir like the rest, but when he pulled it open the drawer ran shorter than the others, 6 inches less depth than the second drawer above it. He set the drawer on the desk. He held it up. He pressed his palm against the back of the drawer's interior, and the back panel moved. He worked his fingers carefully into the seam at the back, the way a man opens a thing he is not certain he wants to open. The hinged false back swung inward on a small brass hinge. In the small hidden space behind the false back, he found 3 things. The first thing was a small leather-wrapped bundle, soft from age, tied with a leather cord. He set it on the desk and untied the cord and unwrapped the leather slowly. Inside, in a sealed wax paper packet, was money, old American bills, mostly 10s and 20s and 50s, the small format kind printed before 1928, and the larger format kind printed between 1928 and 1962. He counted them later, on the desk, by the light of the kerosene lantern Owen had given him. The total came to $26,400 even. The second thing was a small velvet pouch, deep green, drawn closed with a satin cord. Inside, when Mateo carefully poured them onto the desk, were 7 gold sovereigns, small, bright English coins, dated between 1889 and 1922, each one stamped with the head of Queen Victoria or King George. The third thing was a letter, folded once. The paper was the color of weak tea. Mateo sat at the writing desk with the lantern at his elbow, and he opened the letter and he read it. To whoever finds this, my name is Eilert Sørensen. I came to this country from a small fishing village outside Stavanger in southern Norway in the spring of 1893, when I was 17 years old. I worked as a deckhand on the cod boats out of Astoria from 1894 to 1905, and on the steamships out of Portland from 1905 to 1923. I joined the United States Lighthouse Service in 1923, and was assigned to Cape Halgren Light as second assistant in 1924. I became principal keeper in 1937. I held that post until I retired in 1958. I never married. I had no children. The 7 sovereigns are not mine. They were my father's, sent from Stavanger in 1894 with a letter that read, in Norwegian, "Buy a small piece of America with these, and remember us." I never spent them. I could not. They were the last thing my father gave me, and I outlived him by 46 years. I did not trust the banks after the run of 29. So I saved what I could, year by year, of my keeper's salary, and I put it where I knew it would be safe, behind the same Douglas fir that had held my logbooks for 34 years. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the Pacific has rolled in and out many times without me. I do not know who you are. I do not know how you found this cottage. But I will tell you what I would have told a young keeper on his first night at the lamp, when I had a young keeper to tell. The fog does not care whether you are tired. The wind does not care whether you are afraid. The light is the work. You trim the wick, and you keep the flame, and you do it well, because somewhere out there is a sailor whose name you will never know, and he is steering by your light tonight. This cottage was the joy of my life. I lit the first lamp here on a January evening in 1924. I closed the door on a March morning in 1958, and I never came back because some things are too dear to come back to. Whoever you are, please open the door. Please let the headland see a lamp in this window again. The money is yours. The sovereigns are yours. Use them for the cottage. Use what is left for yourself. Live well. Be kind to the old men who take you in. Be patient with the young men who will need you to teach them. That is all I have. Eilert Sørensen, March 1958. Mateo read the letter twice. He folded it carefully along the original crease. He set it on the desk beside the lantern. He picked it up again. He set it down. He pressed the heel of his right hand against his eyes. He did not cry. His throat tightened and his eyes burned, but he did not let it come. He sat there at the desk in the dim kerosene light, with his mother's brass harmonica on the desk beside him, and Eilert Sørensen's letter at his hand, and he stayed that way for a long time. When he finally moved, he folded the letter into a small leather pouch he had bought that week at Owen's hardware store, and he set the pouch in the inside left pocket of the mackinaw, opposite the pocket where the harmonica lived. He closed the leather-wrapped bundle. He banked the lantern. He walked out the Dutch door and stood on the small flat granite stoop of the cottage, and he watched the moon come up over the dark line of the coast range to the east. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, was there a craft or a trade in your family that did not survive into your generation? The first thing he did was the foundation. He had learned, walking the perimeter of the cottage at low tide on the second morning, that the basalt block foundation along the seaward wall had lost almost all of its mortar in 60 years of salt wind, and that the wall was beginning to settle in 2 places. Owen, when he came out to the cottage the following Saturday in his old Ford, told him plainly that a cliff cottage with a failing foundation is no longer a cottage. It is just a building waiting for the next 10-year storm. The basalt blocks were the whole point of the place. Eilert Sørensen and the first principal keeper before him had hand-quarried each block from the cliff face below the cottage in the spring of 1898, and the wall had stood through 97 Pacific winters. So, through August and September, while the late summer turned slowly toward Oregon autumn, Mateo worked on the foundation. He hired a retired stonemason named Garrett Whitman, who lived in a small house on the inland edge of Yachts, and who was 68 years old, to teach him how to repoint a dry-laid basalt wall. Garrett charged him only the cost of materials and an honest day's labor, and showed him how to chisel the failing mortar out of the joints, mix a fresh lime and Portland mortar at the right consistency, and trowel it back into the wall in even passes, working from the bottom up. Mateo bought lime and mortar at Owen's hardware store at cost. He worked 4 hours a day, the most his back could stand at first. By the 3rd week, he was working 8. He found the rhythm of the work in the 3rd week. There was something in it that felt like prayer. The smell of fresh lime and basalt dust, the slow scrape of the trowel against stone, the patient rebuilding of a wall that had been failing for 30 years. It felt, he thought, like setting a thing right that had been wrong for a long time. The first restoration milestone came in mid-September. The seaward wall was sound. The mortar was set. The cottage no longer settled when Mateo pushed against the corner with both hands. On a Thursday afternoon, with Owen sitting on a flat basalt rock above the cliff path and watching, Mateo had taken his mother's brass harmonica out of his coat pocket and had stood on the cottage stoop facing the Pacific and had played a slow 8-bar blues into the wind. The wind had taken the sound and carried it out over the surf. Owen had taken off his cap and had set it on his knee, and had said, in his slow, quiet voice, "Well, there she stands." By October, word had begun to spread. Yachts was a village of 700 year-round people, and a young Filipino boy with a Mackinaw coat and a $1 deed on a long-abandoned keeper's cottage did not remain a stranger in a village of 700 for very long. People began to drive down the unmarked gravel track on calm afternoons. There was a woman named Ingrid Halvorsen, Owen's older sister, 76, a retired schoolteacher who had been a girl in the cottage on weekend visits with her father and grandfather, both of whom had been Coast Guard men. Ingrid had driven out one Saturday in late August in her own pickup, carrying a covered dish of Norwegian fish stew and a small loaf of homemade lefse. And she had sat at the parlor bench and had told Mateo about the way the cottage had smelled in 1958, when her grandfather had brought her along on a Sunday inspection visit and had introduced her to Eilert Sørensen at the kitchen table. He was a small, thin man, Ingrid had said, already 82 then. He had a Norwegian accent so thick I could hardly understand him. He gave me a sugar cookie from a tin he kept in this drawer right here. He told me, in Norwegian, a young keeper is the future of an old light. I have never forgotten it. Mateo had not known what to say to that, so he had not said anything. There was an old fisherman named Gary Pickett, 73, who had been a high school boy in Yachts in 1958, and who had once, during a violent winter storm in February of that year, rowed out from the cove below Cape Halgren in his father's small skiff with a load of firewood for Eilert when the keeper's woodpile had run low. Gary came out twice that fall, the second time with a small black-and-white photograph he had taken with his father's box camera that day. Eilert, standing at the cottage door in a peacoat and watch cap, half smiling at the boy with the firewood, the white tower behind him. Mateo asked Gary if he could keep the photograph. Gary told him he had been hoping he would ask. Mateo pinned it to the wall of the parlor above the writing desk. There was a woman named Imelda Aquino, 65, a Filipina-American widow who ran a small Filipino bakery on the main street of Yachats. A single old display case of pan de sal and ensaimada and baco that she had run alone since her husband had died in 2019. Mateo had not known there was another Filipino family on the Central Oregon coast until the third Saturday. Imelda came out to the cottage with a paper sack of pan de sal and a small jar of latik. She had not stayed long the first 3 Saturdays. She would set the food on the parlor bench, look around the cottage with sharp dark eyes, nod once, and drive back to Yachats. The 4th Saturday she had stayed. She had sat on the parlor bench and watched Mateo work on a hand-planed window casing, and after a while she had said, "My father was a deckhand on the boats out of Astoria in the 1950s. He told me, when I was a small girl, about a Norwegian lighthouse keeper south of Yachats, who had once helped him in a fog so thick that no one else on the coast had seen his light. He said the man's name was Sørensen. He said that man had saved his life." Mateo had not known what to say to that, so he had not said anything. Imelda had stood up. She had brushed the dust from her skirt. She had walked to the Dutch door and stopped there a moment with one hand on the frame, looking out at the Pacific. Then she had driven back to Yachats, and had come back the next Saturday with another sack of pan de sal, the way she had every Saturday before. By November, Mateo had hired 2 more men to help with the heavier work. Garrett's son-in-law, who knew old roofing, and a young man named Aaron from the village, who had needed work and who had watched Mateo from the gravel track for 2 weeks before he had finally come down and asked. Owen himself drove out 3 afternoons a week and sat on a basalt rock and gave instruction in the slow, sparing way of men who have done a thing for 50 years. By the first week of December, the cottage was sound. The foundation was repointed. The roof had been reshingled with new cedar shake. The Dutch door had been rehung on fresh hinges. 3 of the 6 tall windows had been reglazed, and on a clear, cold evening in mid-December, when the first hard frost of the winter pushed down out of Canada and the headland grass turned silver, Mateo stood on the granite stoop of the cottage at sunset, and he listened to the surf below him, and he thought about Eilert Sørensen and his mother. That's the thing about old places. They do not forget who walked their floors, and they do not forget what their walls were built to hold. A cottage that was built to keep a lamp burning remembers a lamp burning. A boy who was raised on a small clean apartment porch in northwest Portland by a single mother who played the harmonica into the summer air remembers the harmonica, even after she is gone. Mateo's mother had been gone for 2 years. Linda had not lived to see Mateo finish his senior year of high school sleeping on 3 different couches. She had not lived to see him take a Greyhound bus 4 hours west to the Pacific. She had not lived to see the first lamp lit again in the cottage window of Cape Halgren in 63 years. But her brass harmonica still rode in the inside left chest pocket of the Mackinaw coat she had bought him, and Mateo played it now on the granite stoop of the cottage in the evenings, slow blues, and the old Filipino kundiman his mother had played, and the wind took the sound out over the Pacific. He thought, sometimes on the cool nights, of the father he had never known. The thin, tall young man on the beach in Astoria in 2005. He thought of him with less heat than he had once thought. The man had not known what his hands were for when he was 25, and the world had not given him time to learn. He thought more often of Owen, of Mr. Kowalski in Mount Tabor Park, who had walked his dog past Mateo's bench every morning for 2 months, of Ingrid and Gary and Imelda, of Eilert Sørensen, dead more than 60 years, whose letter Mateo now kept folded in the leather pouch in the inside left pocket of his coat, opposite the pocket where the harmonica lived. On a clear, cold evening in mid-December, Mateo sat on the granite stoop of the cottage with a tin mug of black coffee in his hands and watched the sun set behind the Pacific. The cottage behind him was sound. The foundation would stand another 50 years. The lamp in the front window was lit, warm yellow light spilling onto the granite stoop. There was a thin curl of wood smoke rising from the small flue of the cast-iron stove inside. Mateo Reyes was 18 years old and homeless. He had $1 to his name, and he spent it on an abandoned lighthouse keeper's cottage on a wind-stripped basalt headland called Cape Halgren on the central Oregon coast, 8 miles south of Yakuts. It was the best dollar he ever spent. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you'd like to take these stories with you, we've put together a book of our favorites. And it comes with a full audio version you can listen to any time. The link is in the description below. Tell us in the comments. Was there a craft or a trade in your family that did not survive into your generation? We'd love to hear your story. See you in the next one.